Hello everyone. So this video is all about what is the difference between the tropical and the sidereal zodiac. And I get this a lot, obviously, as an astrologer who uses mostly the sidereal zodiac. And I say mostly because I do have a sort of side glance on the tropical zodiac all the time. And I'll explain why I do that, what is the benefit of that, even just by transits, and maybe that's actually all I use it for, because I certainly don't mix in tropical calculations to the traditional Vedic approach. I've never done that. I did try it once, because you might have heard of astrologers such as Vic Takara, who actually promotes this technique of using ancient traditional Vedic astrology with tropical coordinates. And so that basically prizes apart the sun signs and the nakshatras or lunar mansions completely. So if you know anything about Vedic astrology, and it's certainly the more intricate, in-depth way we use the nakshatras combined with the Rashi to form the Navamsha and so on, I mean, that seems absurd in one way. At the same time, I'm open-minded about everything that anyone does. If it works for them, there must be a reason for it. And that's another reason why I feel like there's no reason to, knock either approach, tropical or sidereal, without really investigating it fully. But for this video, I just wanted to highlight what are the differences, because people do ask me, and they don't really know always why there are two. And certainly when I do readings, I have to introduce most people to the sidereal zodiac. Most people think that when tropical astrologers, let's call them tropicalists, and we'll call sidereal astrologers siderealists just for this video. So when tropical astrologers say Aries, Taurus, Gemini, and so on, they don't actually mean the constellations Aries, Taurus, Gemini. They mean more so the time of year when the sun appears to move through these portions of the zodiac that have been divided out according to the solstices and the equinoxes. So it's all essentially based on those 4 points, the two solstices and the two equinox. So basically, it's seasonal. And this is something to note, that in Vedic text also, there is use of the tropical zodiac for those purposes, for looking at the weather. Now, you can see a couple of problems already. You might identify a couple of issues with that. One being that the weather is all over the place these days. So, like, the actual weather. And the other being, what about the southern hemisphere? So if you're saying, for example, that, you're talking about tropical Aries or Aries season, Taurus season, you'll hear tropicalists use this phrase over and over again when they refer to the sun moving through that sign. And again, it's a sign, not the constellation, Aries, Taurus, whichever. So when they say Aries season, it's obviously not Aries spring season on the southern hemisphere. It's actually it's the autumn moving into the winter. So it's the opposite. So there's also then a whole other approach that has been promoted by certain astrologers on the southern hemisphere. I think one astrologer in particular, who lives in South Africa, who promotes this, like, literally switching it. So if you're on the southern hemisphere, you just like literally switch it. So that's, I haven't looked into that to any great degree, but anyway, that's a whole other thing, because that's, again, only if you're talking about tropical signs, and again, not constellations. So the constellations are the constellations. They are the star signs. That's why it's called sidereal. So if you're a siderealist, you literally are referring to the stars. If you're a tropicalist, you're referring to the signs and the time of year. So that's the key difference. But I want to use examples. There's a couple of things. I'm going to use the example of Pluto, and I'm going to use a chart example of Donald Trump. So I can hear the many eye rolls that is going on if you're listening to this and you're like, "Oh, what, another Donald Trump?" I'm going to show you why actually he's a good case study in this case. But first, I'm going to talk about Pluto, and you can see here I have the chart up, but actually it doesn't look like where the planets actually are if you're following the sidereal zodiac, because these are the tropical positions. So I put in I've taken out, in other words, the Ayanamsha or the sidereal, and this is now the tropical chart that I have up. So this is where all the planets are right now. You can see here Saturn is in Pisces in the tropical zodiac. Neptune is also in Pisces at the end of Pisces, so therefore it's also at the beginning of the sign Pisces in the sidereal. And that's the other thing to know, actually, before we get into this, and this can be a bit confusing, I understand, but basically there are different calculations, or what is called Ayanamsha, that we use to subtract these positions here, the tropical positions, to arrive at the sidereal. And because of this precession of the equinoxes, as it's called. So although around the 20th of March every year, the sun is seen to move into the first degree of tropical Aries, if we subtract, by most estimations, 24 degrees from that, we go back to 6 degrees to Pisces, 6 degrees of Pisces. So in other words, 6 degrees of sidereal Pisces is equivalent to the first degree, the 0 degree mark of tropical Aries. So most people use 24-degree mark at this point, but there are different calculations, and I'll just maybe highlight some of those. So here you have, I put in no Ayanamsha, so I've just taken out that precession and use the tropical. The one I use is the Chitra Paksha, and that Chitra is referring to Chitra. You might be familiar with Chitra lunar mansion that is split evenly between Virgo and Libra, and the middle of Chitra is where we see the star Spica, and that's one of the brighter stars, and so that is used to calculate the beginning of the zodiac, because it actually is seen to be the very beginning of Libra, sidereal Libra. So then you go opposite, and then you get 0 degrees of Aries. So that's how not most, but many Vedic astrologers calculate 0 degrees of Aries. There's a Fagin Bradley, and Cyril Fagin, of course, was the famous Irish astrologer who had his own Ayanamsha. There's that Lahiri, which is basically the same as Chitra Paksha. That's the standardized Ayanamsha. But there are others as well that we use. And really, essentially, there isn't really that much of a difference. It kind of goes from 22 degrees to 24 degrees. So most people are going to use within that range. So 24 degrees is what I use. And basically, it means that you have to take all of these positions in the chart here and move them back 24 degrees, essentially. So the sun isn't at 15 degrees of Leo. You have to take 24 degrees off and move it back into Cancer. Likewise, Venus, 24 degrees. So if it's in tropical Leo, 23 degrees right now, it means that it's at the very last degree, taking 24 degrees, the very last degree of Cancer right now. So it's just backed up into Cancer retrograde. So you do that with all the planets, essentially. But I want to focus on one, that's Pluto, and then talk about Donald Trump as a case study, as an example of somebody's chart, how that plays out. So why Pluto? Well, first of all, when you're talking about two different calculations and you don't really even have it down with one, like you're not like fluent. I used an example before about languages, that when you're learning a language, you really want to learn that language well before you then learn another language. It's very hard to learn two different languages at the same time, because essentially you're going to get confused with grammar rules and all of this. So you want to learn one well, and then you can learn another. And actually, it might make it easier to learn another once you've learned a new language. So this is what it's like with astrology too. And the reason I'm using Pluto is because it's slow moving. So you need to take your time with seeing the results of the transits of a planet like Pluto, as opposed to the very fast moving Venus, Mars, Mercury, all of these, the sun. They move so quickly that it's very hard to keep track of it if you're trying to look at two different zodiacs or two different calculations. So Pluto is going to give you a good idea. So I want to use the example of Pluto also because you can just see it over many years how this is playing out and how it continues to play out, both from the tropicalist viewpoint and the siderealist. So going back to 2008, tropicalists would say that as soon as Pluto moved into tropical Capricorn in 2008, that was the start of the financial crash, the meltdown, and therefore it signaled this Pluto in Capricorn transit. And that all makes sense. That makes sense that Pluto, which dissolves things, which changes things, transforms things, as it's always said, first must begin to actually break things down for something to be changed. So in 2008, when Pluto moved into tropical Capricorn, that reflects that kind of theme very well. It is currently at the end of Capricorn, having just moved into Aquarius briefly for a couple of months earlier this year, but it's backed up into Capricorn again. And essentially, what you have Tropicalist referring to now is this new AI technology revolution and all of that. And so you could see some of that as well, because the AI thing with Pluto and Aquarius is showing also all the fear and this dystopian sort of view of what may happen in the future. Because Aquarius is very much about the future. And Pluto, again, can dissolve things for sure and kind of change things essentially, and can show our changing view of the future now because of all of these new AI technologies. So all of that in a way makes sense. It does all make sense. But so does the sidereal. And you could argue for either. And I could make an argument, for example, that actually, wait a minute, in 2008, was it Pluto in Capricorn or was it Jupiter moving into Capricorn that led to the financial crash? Because have we not maybe, initially heard all of that in 2008 with the crash, but then what about since then? We haven't heard about anything until 2020. And then all of a sudden in 2020, then there was all of this a lot of talk about this crashing system again. What happened in 2020 is that Pluto moved into sidereal Capricorn. 2020, the beginning of. So now we have another kind of storyline going on concurrently. And this, by the way, I'm just using this one example of this one planet. You can do it with all of the planets. You can use both languages, tropical and sidereal, to describe the same story with using different verbs and using different words and all of that in different ways. So one is Pluto into tropical Capricorn 2008, kind of went quiet for a while, and then many a tropical astrologer will refer to the end of a transit as bringing up the themes again. So in other words, a lot of tropicalists are talking about the end of Pluto in tropical Capricorn as showing this 2020 breakdown and all of that, the system crashing and everything shut down. So all of that. And I mentioned this before, and a lot of the time, tropicalists fail to keep an eye on the siderealist or the sidereal view as much as the other way around, because siderealists tend to be more aware of the tropical simply because it's the mainstream. So it doesn't mean that they're practicing both, and a lot of siderealists aren't that aware of the tropical transits or keep an eye on them regularly, but they're more aware of them than I think the other way around. And that is just a shame in a way, because I think they're missing out. And what I see all the time is that tropicalists talking about the end of a transit in a sign. So Pluto's end of its transit in Capricorn. Obviously, if you take 24 degrees off the end of Capricorn, you're going to go back to the beginning of Capricorn in the sidereal zodiac. So what they're essentially missing out, what they don't realize they're saying, is that the end of Pluto in tropical Capricorn and the breakdown of the system is equivalent to Pluto having just entered sidereal Capricorn, showing the breakdown. And so this is why I'm bringing up Pluto, because we're going to see this play out over many years, and it's going to become more and more obvious how this is like this divergent view, these two separate views are going on. Because over the years, and by the way, in future generations, this will become more and more separated, because it's at 24 degrees. It changed to 24 degrees actually in our lifetime. If you're old enough, you would have started out with 23 degrees of a difference. It's now moved to 24. Every 72 years, it moves back a degree. So it's at 6 degrees now, but in the future generations, it will actually move all the way back, so that there will be a whole sign of a difference. So it won't be now 0 degrees Aries going back to 6 degrees of Pisces. It'll be 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then go into Aquarius. So actually, you'll have to move it back 2 signs, from Aries back to Aquarius. So future generations of astrologers will not be able to keep up this, I think, ignorance of this, what's happening, because really it is ignorance. What future generations will have to do is reconcile this to zodiac view. and make sure that they both are seen and valid. And again, it's just a shame these days that a lot of tropical astrologers don't look at the sidereal view, and vice versa. So Pluto, again, like I said, in Capricorn right now, and in the beginning of Capricorn in the sidereal, at the end here, as you can see in the tropical, is showing again the continued breakdown of the system, banking system, government systems. We're seeing yet another coup, in the latest one in Niger. So it's like just this constant breaking down of world systems, of systems that keep everything in check. And that usually means a banking system where we file all our money away and all of that, a government system that keeps everything in order. Because Capricorn is all about order and systems and structures, and they make us feel safe. And Pluto in Capricorn tends to make us feel unsafe because we don't know what's going on. And we kind of have this, again, maybe this dystopian view of the future because everything is changing. The thing is, and this is where I might argue a little bit about the tropical view here, and simply maybe because of the narrative, because what tropicalists are referring to, and again, I'll go back so you can see maybe how this is playing out. Pluto had initially moved in the summer, earlier in the summer, into tropical Aquarius, and the narrative tropicalists have is that this is showing the new tech. My argument there would be, and actually their argument is that it's not just Pluto in Aquarius, it's now also Saturn in Pisces. And so that is for them a signature of the new tech, of building the new infrastructure and the new AI systems. It's just, for me, that is a bit of a stretch because Aquarius is certainly the new tech, but Pluto doesn't build when it moves into a sign initially. It tears down. So that's where I'm not really on it really with the tropical view of, again, it's just the narrative. I would use a different narrative. I can certainly see the story of the dystopian view of the future as Pluto in Aquarius. I can certainly see that, and this fear of the future and our changing view of the future is another way we could describe Pluto in Aquarius. But as when we get to Donald Trump's chart, I'm going to use this as an example again. It's important that we know what we're talking about when we're talking about either zodiac, is that we have to be really clear because we can often just parrot other people who parrot other people, and it just goes on, and we just say things we don't think about what we're saying. So if we're saying that currently there's this kind of building of new infrastructures and AI technologies, and it really essentially like another revolution, a tech revolution, then is that Pluto in Aquarius? Or actually is it, if I go now and show you the sidereal view, is it, go back to Chitra Paksha, is it actually Saturn in Aquarius? Because Saturn is going to move back from Pisces to Aquarius in the sidereal zodiac. Is Saturn not the one that builds? Is Saturn not the one that puts in new infrastructure in Aquarius? Just putting it out there, it's just a question. And also at the same time, while this new system, all of these systems, tech systems and AI systems are implemented and literally being built around us right now with Saturn in the more immediate time frame this year and next year, especially, Pluto continues to move through Capricorn in the sidereal zodiac and will do for many, many years. So in other words, you can't build a new system without slowly tearing down the old one. And you can't tear down the old one overnight. It's going to take a long time. It's going to take another 20 years to completely get rid of cash, to completely get rid of cars that we have on the road at the moment that are petrol and diesel, to completely get rid of whatever old system that we have, and then the new system to be coming online. So that's the one kind of reservation I have about the narrative, more so about the tropical transits right now, if we talk about Pluto in Capricorn versus Pluto in Aquarius. And again, that's Saturn in Pisces, which is what a lot of tropical astrologers are referring to as building the new tech. I just don't see that as building the new tech. Saturn in Pisces. For me, I'm not sold on that. For me, Saturn in Aquarius is more about building the new tech. And actually, currently, if we see what's happening right now, more especially Saturn retrograde in Aquarius is showing the wanting to kind of slow down the new tech and AI, the fear of that. That's Saturn is fear also. So it's also that, wanting to maybe step it back a bit, or maybe regulations in place because of the fear of what AI could do in the future. That for me is all Saturn in Aquarius. It's not Saturn in Pisces. But again, you might have your own views on that, and I'll leave them to you. And maybe if you'd like to comment about that for yourself, I would love to hear what your take is on that. So that is Pluto. The chart example, like I said, is Donald Trump. So let's go to Donald Trump. This is his sidereal chart, the one I usually use. And he has Leo rising, Mars and Leo, and you might be familiar with this chart at this point. I mean, I've shared it so many times that you should be familiar with it. If you just started following me, though, this might be an introduction to the sidereal chart. He has Leo in both the sidereal and the tropical. And that's because even though his rising degree is at 6 degrees, almost 7 degrees, he's old enough for it to have been only 23 degrees of a difference when he was born. So it's like I said, it's moved to 24 degrees currently, but it was 23 when he was born. So therefore, it's still at the very last degree of Leo in the tropical zodiac. Because this is like, say, let's say this is 7 degrees. You add 23 degrees, it's almost 30 degrees. It's not quite. So he's very end of Leo and beginning of Leo in both zodiacs. So he's Leo in both, essentially. And this is interesting because Donald Trump, who is essentially a very divisive figure, this is the one thing that tropicalists and siderealists can agree on, that he's got Leo rising. There's no doubt about that. He's Leo rising, true and true. He's just sort of like the embodiment of Leo, really. I don't think you can think of anyone who's more Leo than Donald Trump. But what about the rest of it? What about all the other planets? Because they're all going to move. The only planets that don't move in his chart are Venus and Saturn, because you can see Venus and Saturn here at the very beginning of Cancer, sidereal Cancer. Therefore, if you put them forward 23 degrees to the tropical, they're still going to be in Cancer. Apart from that, actually, and Mars as well. Mars is still in Leo. So again, although a very divisive figure, it's kind of like the one figure we can all agree on, both zodiacs. He's kind of got this Leo, Mars energy, and he's got this Saturn, Venus in the 12th house energy. And this is using whole sign houses, by the way. All the other planets are going to change, though, and this is what I want to emphasize here. And this is where I think the narrative, the storyline, the words that we use are really important, because what tropicalists would say about Donald Trump is that he is a very sort of contrary or contradictory individual. He contradicts himself all the time. What they attribute that to is, if I show you his tropical chart. So just again take out the Ayanamsha, no Ayanamsha. So again, you can see Leo's rising still, Mars is here, Venus and Saturn in the 12th. Everything else is different, but these are the same. What they attribute that to is that he's Leo rising, and Leos can be exaggerated, and exaggerate their speech quite a lot, because the second lord is the 11th lord and it's Mercury, and Mercury tends to be a bit sort of at times contradictory. But they're attributing it to his sun, North Node and Uranus, all of that, but the sun primarily in Gemini, the 11th sign. For Leo, his ruler, the sun in the 11th sign. But what are you saying when you say, so this is where I'm going to get a bit picky about what the narrative is, because if they're saying, most tropicalists would say that of Donald Trump, that he is a very sort of contradictory character. He contradicts himself all the time. What are we saying, though? Because when you say you contradict yourself, is that not your speech? Are you not contradicting yourself by the things you say? And therefore, do you not need to look at the second house lord, i.e., Mercury? And is this tropical position of Mercury in Cancer now, not in Gemini as it is in the sidereal? Is that really describing a contradictory speech? I don't know. Because if I go back to the Ayanamsha that I use, now we're going to place the second and the 11th lord in the 11th house Gemini. So Mercury in Gemini, the second lord, yes, he has contradictory speech. He contradicts himself all the time. So again, it's important that we think about the words that we're using when we describe a person's chart, whether we're using tropical or sidereal. This is my point here. Because we could then say that the sun, which in this case has gone back to Taurus, the 10th whole sign for Leo, is that his nature is about wanting to build a name for himself and fame for himself and a business empire, essentially, the 10th house. Sun, Rahu, Uranus, all in the 10th house Taurus. That would describe his, his need for a position in the world. Like he is so about that, but that his speech is mercurial, is contradictory, and it exaggerates because it's the 11th house. So that's just an example of, one person's chart with just one planet or a couple of planets there, just to refer to both zodiacs, how we really need to be clear about what we're saying, I think, and precise. And the more precise we can be, I think the more clear we can be about the different approaches in the zodiac. Because tropicalists certainly can be, and they say it all the time, where it's more symbolic. It's more, and you hear this all the time if they're talking about the time of year and the season of the signs, like an Aries season, like it symbolizes that time. Or if it's just generally symbolic of a transit of a planet in a tropical sign, that it's like the energy, and the word energy is thrown about a lot, let's face it, by both sides, tropical and sidereal. But I would add that I think it's used a lot more by tropicalists. Whereas sidereal, you might say, is getting more precise. You could argue that for sure because you're getting more precisely aligned with the stars, literally. And this is the other thing, and I posted recently the ascendants, because even though Donald Trump is not a good example because he's got the same ascendant in both zodiacs, so he is pure Leo. He looks like Leo. There's no denying he's Leo, you know. Um, with other people, you're going to have different rising signs, tropical and sidereal, a lot of the time. And so that example of all of the ascendants that I gave was for that reason. I wanted to show you how we can look at sidereal signs as being maybe more of their physical being, because the ascendant is that. But if we're saying that the tropical zodiac is more symbolic, then we don't really want to use the tropical to describe somebody's physical features. If, for example, your Aries rising in the tropical, but you're actually Pisces rising in the sidereal, you're physically more Pisces, but symbolically maybe Aries, but not literally. So, and actually, I've seen astrologers, and one particular astrologer I'm thinking of, I won't mention his name, but he is Aries rising sidereal and tropical Taurus, and he looks to me more like an Aries rising. He's actually a typical Aries rising physically, but he doesn't identify with that. He identifies with Taurus. He doesn't look at all to me like a Taurus. So that's again why I I mentioned this, because he talks about Aries as if it were not him, which is interesting because he's not identifying with a part of him. He's putting it into the 12th house where it obviously was going to go, because you process the signs, you go backwards. So he sees himself as tropical Taurus and doesn't see himself as Aries. And so it's making it more unconscious in a way. That's a whole other argument, to be honest. That's a whole other debate. I could go into that more and more and maybe do another video on that, but that's a side point. What I wanted to say here is that we really just need to be really clear to finish on this point of why we're using either, what we're using it for, and our words, the words that we use to describe somebody, and be very precise, I would say. And you can be precise with the tropical, just be clear about what you're using it for. So I hope you got something out of that. I hope you enjoyed that. And if you have any questions, of course, feel free to post below. If you have any thoughts about any of that, I would love to hear your thoughts. And until next time.